Great, it's a couple of minutes past the hour now, so I think that we'll have a start. So, bit of an introduction. I'm Georgia Halston and I'm co-founder of NHS Sustainability Partnerships. This is our third webinar today. We had a transport webinar this morning, we had a nutrition webinar this afternoon at lunchtime, and this is our third today, and we're going to be talking about energy optimization, analytics, all those cool types of things. If you do want to see any of our webinars that you weren't able to attend earlier today, everything has been recorded, everything is going to be up on our website, and there'll also be a write-up of all the events, and everything will be going out on social media as well, so you can catch up on anything that you've missed earlier on today. So for our third and final webinar for the Day of Action, we're going to be talking about energy. So with emerging digital technology allowing for greater power optimization and analytics, energy efficiency is evolving. The NHS can reduce energy costs, increase resiliency, and meet sustainability goals by implementing effective energy management. We have invited an expert panel today of sustainable energy innovators, leaders and suppliers to discuss the future of powering the NHS towards the net zero targets. So for a bit of an introduction to who we have on the panel, we've got Beth Goodwin. She's a senior account manager and NHS specialist at Inenco. And then we're going to be following on from Beth with Ricky Higgins, who's the business development manager at PowerStar. So I'm going to hand straight over to you, Beth, to give a bit of an introduction to who you are, what you do at Inenco, and then get on with the presentation that you've got for us today.
Yep, excellent. Well, thanks. Hi, everyone. And thanks, Georgia, for having us. It's been great to be a part of the Day of Action today. And I've been watching the other webinars. They've been great. We've got quite a lot to stand up to. So I'm just going to load my slides up. So give me a second. I've not got too many of these, so we will get back to just a conversation in not very long. Are those up now, Georgia? Excellent. So for those of you who don't know Inenco, we're an energy consultancy business. We started out over 50 years ago, and our core business has always been in procuring gas and electricity for our clients. Now, our consultancy arm has been working with the NHS on compliance for a very long time. And more recently, we've been bringing our private sector sustainability knowledge into the sector to help with net zero and the wider greener NHS mission. Today, I'm mostly going to focus on how the NHS can best reduce its costs and meet sustainability goals in relation to procurement of electricity. But I'm sure we're going to cover some more of the practical optimization in the discussions following too. And that almost always ends up on gas and how to decarbonise. So I'm sure we'll get around to that. As always, with sustainability, there's a lot to cover. It's very much going to be a whistle-stop tour, and we're going to overview just procurement-related steps your trust can take, but then you can send in further questions for us to talk about afterwards. So procuring energy well is the first step, and it's often overlooked in the net zero journey. It's the #1 action in Healthcare Without Harm's Roadmap for Healthcare Decarbonisation's 7 high-impact actions document. And the NHS has made a great first step by asking all trusts to procure green. And I'm just going to show you the wording around that within the Service Condition 18 on screen now. Okay, so the thing to notice in here is the first is it's talking about duration of any existing agreements. Now, for the majority of electricity contracts, actually to ask for an uplift to a REGO-backed renewable tariff does not impact on your existing agreements. You can do this at any time. So you can start to procure REGO-backed green from the next month after you request it from a supplier. And the way they tend to implement this is to just add a surcharge to your existing unit rate. What you're also going to notice is that there is absolutely no requirement put in here for additionality to the grid. And this goes into a little more detail within the Net Zero National Health Service document. And you can see their wording around this here, which is they're aware that going to a REGO-backed tariff isn't going to create additionality, but it demonstrates the system's commitment to net zero. Now, for me, we need to go a little bit beyond this. And most trusts are going to be meeting the contractual obligations that they have by moving on to a REGO-backed green energy tariff. And your consultancy partner is important in this journey because you need to look at the actual suppliers you're talking to. So all electricity suppliers purchase their energy from generators. They do this mostly through power purchase agreements with individual generation sources to provide them with power. And suppliers can choose which generators they approach to create these agreements. And because of that, all suppliers have their own individual fuel mix that they're legally obligated to publish and which describes which generators they have agreements with. So when you put these together, you create the grid emissions factor, which a lot of you will be familiar with, because that's the thing that's been reducing over time to provide you with this carbon saving, even though you might be procuring the same amount of energy through your electricity. So this is something that we've just put together here. Now, this is freely available. This is just taken from supplier websites. This isn't any special knowledge that we have as consultants. You can go out and find these things yourselves, and they will be updated soon. Your choice of electricity supplier isn't going to make any difference to your reporting on your carbon emissions usage if you're on a REGO backed renewable tariff. But it does make a difference to the pressure in terms of renewable demand it drives. So you can see from this, with any of these suppliers, you could pay a premium for a renewable tariff, and you could declare 100% renewable electricity import on your ERIC returns. But the reality behind each of them is actually very different depending on who you procure with. So when you want to look at a supplier, you're trying to choose a supplier with a better than grid average renewable in their fuel mix. And that's going to increase the demand for them and reduce it for those with less green fuel mixes. With any of these suppliers, you can have a conversation with them and you can set up other agreements to directly procure from particular fuel mixes. However, you can see that if you were to procure with, say, npower, for example, the majority of their agreements are with natural gas generators. Whereas if you procure with, say, Haven Power, the majority of theirs, in fact, all of theirs are with renewable generators. So you might not be able to show a direct additionality based on how you procure your electricity, but you are able to make a statement of your desire to drive the grid in the right direction. And that's something we think is very important for the NHS. So our current NHS portfolio was tendered with fuel mix as part of the consideration because this was identified as important to the trusts who we were designing it around. The successful electricity suppliers on that are Smartest and Opus, and you can see in the table they have fuel mixes of at least 97% renewables. That was without fuel mix being a high priority item on the tender, but by asking the question, you can make sure that it is considered. So moving beyond fuel mix, I'm just going to move into another graph, which is taken from the Delivering a Net Zero National Health Service document. And we're going to talk a little bit here around the implications for on-site generation of renewables. So it's the next thing we would say to a trust to consider once you've looked at how you're procuring your electricity is it feasible to install renewables on your existing site? And you could consider other things here. So you can consider boreholes to reduce your water emissions from import as well. And you can look at some other sort of networks from heat if you've got particularly green heat networks in your local area. But looking at on-site generation of renewable energy, you're mostly going to be looking at solar. And you can see on screen that they're expecting the NHS to manage to contribute 580 kilotons of CO2 equivalent reduction in emissions from the secondary estate only from installing on-site generation. So this is a really big undertaking that's going to be coming over the next 5 to 10 years. And it's definitely something you want to be understanding how much scope you have for as soon as possible. So I'm going to move away from the graphs now and come back off of share. There we go. That should now be all off screen. So the main thing here is you want to look at installing as much generation on site as possible. And what this is going to do is it's going to reduce not only your emissions, but also your trust costs. And it's quite a no-brainer to try and get your renewable feasibilities done as a high priority. Where a site's rural or it's close to some areas with large council spaces, you might also find there's opportunities for private wire PPAs. And this is something that can also have a very large cost saving. The main benefit being that they take away the non-commodity tax element because they don't go through the national grid. So because of the way a private wire PPA works, you're installing your own infrastructure from a generator direct to your site. And that means that it's a wire which is owned by either yourselves or the generator themselves. They are responsible for the maintenance on it, and therefore it is not a part of the national grid, and you don't pay for your non-commodity element of your cost. And the non-commodities at the moment can make up to 65% of your bill. So that's a significant opportunity for cost savings. The trouble is, this is a bit of a lottery. So not all trusts or specific sites for certain trusts are going to have the space around them for these kinds of schemes. It does remain that you could go for an option where you can look at a PPA through a corporate PPA, which comes through the grid. Here, you'd still pay for your commodity and your non-commodity. However, you're actually able to look at prospective generators and prove the viability of one of their projects. So you can, at this point, prove additionality, as long as you're getting in at ground level before they have approval to go ahead with their scheme. So that's really the gold standard. If you were able to sign a 7 to 10 year agreement with, say, a solar farm that wanted to put in local generation in, for example, somewhere in the Yorkshire Dales, they've got some farmland and they want to install, but they've not yet got sign off. Your agreement to purchase their electricity could stand them in really good stead to get funding approval. And that proves additionality into the grid, which is a really powerful statement, but it does require long contractual arrangements. They can be quite complex contractual arrangements, and it does put you at risk of pricing changes depending on how you go about that. So if it's not suitable for your trust, and for a number of trusts it's never going to be suitable, selecting the right supplier for a REGO backed tariff becomes absolutely crucial so that you can do as much good as possible. So you'll notice I've barely mentioned gas and heat so far. Renewable gas guarantee of origin market is pretty small, and generally suppliers are recommending offsetting instead. And that's a can of worms that's a bit too big to open on a short talk like this. So as we look to decarbonise heat, it's likely that my comments on electricity are going to become more and more important. And we're probably never going to see the demand for RGGOs in the same way that we do for REGOs, although I could be proved wrong on that. So procuring well is also crucial for your sustainability plans, because the days of rolling contracts for energy procurement really need to be over. Procurement and the estates teams need to work together to understand the utilities market and to seek out value for the NHS. And then if you can manage to procure well and take advice from a consultant that is giving you the best opportunity to access the market and avoid cost increases, you should be able to ring fence that within your utilities budget and use it for energy reduction projects and for planning how you're going to reduce your overall consumption. So a final procurement related point from me is that we always say what gets measured gets managed. And for your meters, this means embracing automatic meter reading rollouts for your gas suppliers, SMET2 meter rollouts for your non-half hourly meter suppliers, and signing up ideally to a day+1 half-hourly data collection, data aggregation contract alongside your meter operator agreements. So all of you are paying for meter operators. It's usually via your supplier invoicing on a standard day+30 data, but you can arrange to have access to this usage data via your billing meters on day+1. It's a great first priority as an initial step to understanding your consumption. And that would be prior to going down the route of sub-metering programs. By looking at your billing meters first, you can identify where non-24/7 sites have got significant usage outside of hours, and you can identify which sites are first priority for sub-metering. So where you've not got staff on site with the time to dedicate to analysing this, you can look to external assistance to try and get reports of exceptions and poorly performing sites, which can be a real benefit. Very briefly then on optimization, I mentioned earlier energy reduction projects. We would call this optimization, and baselining data for these is crucial so that you can get to an IPMVP approach, which can be taken verifying that the project has achieved the reductions in usage that it expected. I've heard from a number of trusts who undertook LED lighting projects only to find that they can't actually evidence the reductions due to lack of measurement, and that's before and after the install. Or an awareness of other changes in usage in the building. So often people-based and process-based projects can have a large impact without too much CapEx investment. And we're currently being nominated for an energy award under the Energy Efficiency Partnership of the Year category, and that's for working with the NHS on these kinds of projects. So I'll just round up. It might seem counterintuitive to some that an energy consultancy like Enenco, who place utilities contracts, would want to help you to reduce your consumption and drive you towards green procurement. The main thing here is in Enenco, we are dedicated to the net zero journey and to broader sustainability improvements. And for us, we see that we can have the greatest positive impact by reducing the impact of our clients' organisations. So we're really excited to be working with the NHS on your goals. One very quick comment around where you are in this is from the 2019-20 ERIC. You can see that the NHS actually spent £515 million on investment to reduce backlog maintenance, but only £70 million on energy efficiency projects. And we really need to get those two things linked so that your spending is targeted to provide you with the highest value, both in reducing your backlog maintenance and also providing energy efficiency. And I'll close off there, Georgia.
Don't worry about it, Beth. We could listen to you all day, honestly. Great talk. And I think that, you know, we've had various different types of presentations throughout the day and since we've started this this initiative. And, you know, sometimes we have really insightful pieces where people come in and give us loads of stats and it's just really interesting. It's quite ambient, but I feel like you came in, you were like, right, do this. It was just completely practical advice. And it was just straight away, these are some things that you can just do straight off the bat. This is the low hanging fruit. And I really hope that people are taking some value away from that. You know, we can all rattle off the same old stats day in, day out, but, you know, you come in and you give that practical advice straight away. So I really appreciate that. It's really valuable. You know, I also really appreciate, you know, when you're touching on the points around internal collaboration between your energy and your estates companies teams and your procurement teams, and how that, you know, those relationships need to work really, really well together to ensure that everyone's on the same page. You know, that collaboration piece, both within trusts and across the NHS, is such a massive talking point that we've had in pretty much everything that we've run since we've started this year. So I appreciate you touching on that as well. We do have a question, but we're going to wait until after Ricky's talk to do our Q&A session. If anyone does have any questions throughout any of the session, please put in the Q&A. Also, if you just want to say hello, if you want to give some feedback, if you want to say that you appreciated any of the points or you have any further comments, please put them in the chat section. We'd love to hear from everyone on the call. It's not just me and the panelists today, it's everyone on that same collaborative theme. So I'm going to move on to you now, Ricky. If you want to go ahead and share your presentation you've got for us today.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you very much. Make sure I open up the right thing. Okay, can you see that? Great, fabulous. Okay, well, thank you for that, Georgia. And thank you everyone for sticking around. I know it's the last slot on a Friday, so I'll try and keep you entertained, keep you on board for as long as I can. As Georgia said at the beginning, I'm from PowerStar. My name's Ricky. And PowerStar, we are a manufacturer of bespoke battery energy storage systems, and we do that here in Sheffield. And what I'm really here to talk to you about today is power resilience, but power resilience for a net zero world. So a lot of you are probably familiar with power resilience, particularly those of you who are sort of in the acute hospital environment and the importance of that. So I know there's no real need for me to provide a big lecture on, you know, you should be doing this and that to make sure that your sites are secure. I know it's something that already exists, but what I really want to go into is how can we do that moving forward and deliver that resilience in a net zero world. So I'm just going to start on, I will touch on what I'm talking about in terms of power resilience, just in case there's people on here that are less familiar. And really what I'm talking about is UPS, or an uninterruptible power supply. So essentially a fast switching arrangement of a power source that can provide power to your downstream load when your grid supply is interrupted for some reason. That could be voltage dips, a whole host of different issues that can be milliseconds, or they can be minutes and hours long. And the job of the UPS is to protect that downstream load within microseconds. And so it's very fast switching. So as you can imagine, there is probably thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of these devices across the NHS estate, supporting theatres and the likes. And what I tried to think about actually is, okay, its primary job is to provide resilience, but what else is it doing? It's obviously using amount of power. Just to touch back on what Bethany was talking about there, in terms of you're probably spending a lot, yearly, even maintaining those systems, replacing those systems. So obviously it's a vital piece of equipment as part of your site that's going to have actually a significant impact on your sustainability goals, whether you've thought about that already or not. So as I said, that's what I'd call the business as usual. This is something you're doing already and you have been doing for such a long time. But what I want to do is try and take a journey from there, and I don't want to sound cliche, but explore what the alternative options are and how that can help, facilitate some of these other projects. Again, going back to Bethany's presentation, this deployment of renewables and such, and how we can use our power resilience infrastructure to help support those projects. So what I think is the really exciting point around this is what we're calling Resilience Plus. I should really tell you what I mean by and what I'm talking about in terms of Resilience Plus. So as I mentioned at the start, we are a manufacturer of behind the meter energy storage systems, battery energy storage systems. So this is using modern lithium ion technologies to provide as an energy store on site. And what we're looking at really is utilising those modern technologies with fast switching arrangements to provide an alternative to the traditional UPS. And there's a whole host of reasons why you might want to do that. The first thing I'm going to touch on is around energy efficiency, which is obviously up there as core number one, is what we're doing on this road to net zero. Then also all these plus capabilities, and we'll move on to those as we go through. So what am I talking about in terms of a traditional UPS? So these are, as I've explained on the slides before, these systems sit in place. They sit and wait for events from the grid, and then when there is a loss of power, they very quickly support the load, and they are extremely good at doing that. That's primary objective number one, and extremely good. As long as they've been maintained through their life, they will do that. But what are the downfalls of that? And one of the things that we've found, actually, this is a report from Brunel University, is that actually they're very inefficient. And the reason they are inefficient is because they convert lots and lots of energy. They go AC to DC and DC back to AC. So there's lots of losses there. And that report I mentioned from Brunel University found a 10 to 15% loss of the capacity of the UPS. So this is where I'm touching on, how much of the sites of the hospital's load is actually going through UPSs, and how much losses is being built up there. It's something to consider, and put some magnitude on what that may be. If we talk about a 1 megawatt system, which you could probably find in a medium-sized hospital and maybe larger in some of the bigger hospitals, if that's losing 10% of energy constantly throughout the day, all year round, that could actually be costing £200,000 a year. Not to mention, obviously, what are the carbon loss, the effects on carbon there, depending on what you're obviously where you're buying your energy from, and then obviously, it's just a touching point of energy efficiency. So if we compare that to the technology that I've just mentioned, I'm talking about these modern day battery energy storage systems. You get much lower losses, and I'm talking less than 1% of losses. And it does that because the switching arrangement can sit in line, so you still get your fast switching that you need, but we don't have to convert all this energy from AC to DC and back again to keep that energy power flowing. So we can reduce the losses significantly. So that could have a significant impact in terms of what we're talking about as energy efficiencies. Nearly a 10% reduction in the losses across that piece of equipment. But it's not only that. Obviously, as we mentioned before, there's lots of other capabilities that we're going to move on to as to what that system can deliver. And I just think it's important at this point, if I'm talking about switching something that's vitally important in the hospital for another piece of equipment, and I know that is not simple as it sounds. And here at PowerStar, sort of the last 5 years, we've been working with a number of trusts and their consultants to design and deliver these solutions. So we know there's been several iterations of what this solution would look like. Some of our technologies now actually are HDM compliant or have HDM compliance. So it's all about, we've built up a blueprint of a solution that could be a lot more energy efficient for something that, as I said before, you're already spending a lot of money on and probably time on in terms of maintaining them. And the reason I call it a blueprint and it's not a solution is these are not off-the-shelf solutions. They are very bespoke and designed for individual sites. I mentioned we've worked with a number of trusts. None of those sites are the same. None of them are exactly the same application in each site. So it's very much bespoke and built for each individual site. So again, tying this really back into the net zero theme, there's all these things, and again, coming back to what Bethany just mentioned, I've been to a fair few hospitals in my time, and some of them will have generation. A lot of them will have, particularly large ones, combined heat and power generation. Some will have maybe a small amount of solar, but it's definitely on the agenda to increase that on-site renewables. So there's something there that actually, can we help support that with something that we already have? So this power resilience energy infrastructure that we are building, can we utilize that to support increasing renewable generation by making sure that less of that energy will be spilt back to grid, because you've got a big battery there that can harvest that energy when it's not needed and deliver it back when the demand is there. There's also probably, and this again something I will touch on a little bit more later on, something you're probably all going to come across at some point as you go along this journey is grid constraints. So can I actually do any of these projects that I want to do? Can I add more renewables? If I'm changing my heating infrastructure and electrifying that, can I add this additional electrical load? They're all questions that will have to be asked by somebody at some time, and they will ultimately be answered by the network provider. So having this on-site storage system that's providing you your power resiliency could also then enable other projects, as well as other things which have been traditionally talked about for battery storage systems as what we would call it the icing on the cake is can you access other markets and support these projects with a revenue stream through grid service contracts. All of these things come together and really this is what we're talking about in terms of being resilience plus, in terms of you deliver your power resilience and you can achieve more along the way with that as well. And obviously this whole conversation is going off, and I'm sure this whole event is going off because of the pressure that everyone's under. So this net zero targets, and none more than the NHS have committed heavily to that. It's down there 80% reduction by 2032, but we know it's net zero by 2040. We have to do something, and part of that is buying greener energy and putting that onto the suppliers. But there's a big part of that as well for what we need to do in terms of managing our own energy infrastructure to deliver that. And that can cover renewable firming, it can cover energy optimization and energy efficiency measures. But essentially we're under pressure to deliver projects, and we need the smart technology there to help us deliver those. Now, it wouldn't be a presentation in 2021 about energy if I didn't mention EV charging. You probably all talk about it all the time, and for most people it's going to be a headache. For you guys, I assume it's going to be an even bigger headache. I think we've all been to hospital car parks, and we know the space restrictions there. So logistically, I can imagine that's going to be an absolute nightmare. But there's somebody who's also got to answer the question of where does this power come from to support this? I mentioned, the moving from a heating load to an electrical heating load. That could be a big change, but this could be a massive change in terms of your electrical demand requirements on your infrastructure within a hospital. So yeah, how are we going to provide this power? Where is it coming from? And again, to link that back into this new power resilience infrastructure that you're building with a modern battery energy storage system, you could utilize that asset to support that additional load. So, you know, reduce your requirement to bring in new supplies to site, or to manage your against your agreed supply capacity. And you know, we fully expect that EV charging requirement is going to ramp up, and it's going to ramp up very quickly. So it's good to have these things built in, and to have these solutions that, you know, pave the way for that. I did say before I would come back to grid constraints, and you know, I could probably do, and we have done, sort of full webinars on the grid and how it's going to change. I'm sure you've all seen the advert with the little cartoon Einstein who's telling us we all need to have smart meters to help the grid manage itself, which is true, but there's also, again, a lot that we will need to do on our side as end users. So all these wonderful projects that we may want to do, such as adding renewable generation, as I said before, we're going to have to speak to the network operators, and essentially they can say that project cannot happen. It's, you know, you are connected to their network. So we have to have creative solutions that will help us around that if we're going to meet these net zero targets. And you know, these issues could be power flow related. So you know that export limitation. There's a whole load of other things like I just got the word I was looking for then. Yeah, a whole load of other issues that actually stop you being able to connect to that grid. So I've just got a little example here that just reminded me of the word I was looking for, fault currents. So there's an example of a project actually where they couldn't connect more load to their site, which actually has got a bit of generation within there. It was absolute no-go from their DNO. But they needed it, as I'm sure there's a lot of things that will be needed to be added to the hospital, whether it's, you know, the connection is there or not. So this is an example here of a sort of a creative solution where you can utilize a storage system to, first of all, provide power and provide constant power to a load, but also provides a disconnect between the load and the grid. So this is actually an example. There's two storage systems, so actually only the storage system is ever connected to the grid, and the load is always islanded with a battery storage system. Like I said, that's a very niche project, but it's just a demonstration of what can happen when you actually want to start implementing some of these projects and the issues you may come across, and having these flexible solutions in place will help support that as you go forward. So I've sort of briefly ran through there, and with that, I'm happy that we can spend some time talking through questions afterwards. But if I just summarise as to what all of that means, what I've just been waffling through, is that, yeah, like I say, as I said before, here at PowerStar, we design and manufacture smart behind-the-meter battery storage systems. They are primarily focused on delivering seamless backup power supply. So again, something you're already doing, something that's already part of your infrastructure, but we're looking at a modern way of doing that, which is more energy efficient. Let's come back to those sort of 10% losses against what you may be incurring now. But then it also provides these plus elements, this flexibility to be able to build a smart network on your site to allow for these projects which will lead towards your net zero aspirations. And I've got a question section, but I know that George is, probably will jump in to run that. If that's good.
That's great, thanks Ricky.
Thank you very much. Stop sharing that.
The funny thing was as well, I already had written down, because in our transport webinar this morning, there was a lot of questions about EV charging. We had on Victoria from the NHS Trust in Manchester, and she was talking a lot about, you know, all the things that they'd done, cycling and all that type of thing. But EV charging was one of the things that they were talking about quite a lot. And it seems that even though they are trying to get some stuff over the line, what she had said was there may be infrastructures within cities that come along in the next 5 years that would instantly, you know, create redundancies in any of the hardware that they're installing in their big car parks, because if there are supercharging points being built with super fast charging, and hospitals are implementing or installing, you know, slower charging stations now, in the next 5 years they may already be redundant because there'll be a supercharging point around the corner. So although there is a lot of work being done in that space, and they are trying. It's a bit of a, you know, it's a bit of a minefield to navigate what's going to be future proof, and obviously let you know, for the less amount of waste is possible. But yeah, super interesting from both of you guys. We do have a question straight away from Jason Knight, and this one I think was for you, Beth. If, say, all NHS bodies told EDF that they wanted to purchase from them but 100% renewable, would that force them to shift their grid average?
It's a really good question, because actually I think I didn't cover this very well. So the Renewable Energy Guarantee of Origin, which is your REGO, which is how you prove that you're on a renewable tariff, is completely decoupled from the electricity. So what I mean by that is EDF could go out and purchase, which is essentially what happens at the moment. They could go out and purchase enough to cover the whole NHS in terms of REGO certificates, but they wouldn't be under any obligation to purchase the electricity from those generators at the same time. So the markets are not linked unless you have a supplier that chooses to also purchase the electricity at the same time as the certificates. And at the moment, it is a choice. It's not something they have to do.
Okay, great. And I hope that that's answered your question. Jason, if you have any other follow-ups, please let us know. And if anyone else does have any questions, please put them into the Q&A. Also, Beth, I wondered, do you think trusts will be able to offset a lot of their carbon to achieve net zero?
It's a really interesting topic, the offsetting. And I know I sort of said it was a bit too much to go into in a lot of detail, but the real answer here is you could currently, because currently offsetting is incredibly cheap compared to what it would need to be to actually achieve the reductions we need to. The problem you've got is, firstly, it's public money, and should you be spending it on offsetting projects, which actually are, for a lot of them, not in the UK, so you'd be sending public funds outside of the country. That's a huge question. But also the schemes that are currently available to offset, it really should be a last resort, because all of those schemes need to happen anyway in order for us to meet our needs to reduce our carbon impact. So all of these schemes on planting forests, on trying to plant essentially seek help, you get a lot of the sea schemes are becoming really popular now. They have to happen. So yes, we can pour our funds into making them happen, but someone really needs to do that centrally anyway. And what you'll end up with is we actually need to try and remove carbon from the atmosphere if we're still emitting carbon to the atmosphere, which means that the schemes you'll need to look at in the future are going to be things like sequestration schemes and carbon capture from air. And those schemes are in their real infancy at the moment, but they're likely to be much more expensive than the offsetting schemes that are currently available. So we're talking prices in the region of £100 a tonne. At which point it's not going to be economically viable for you to do too much of this. Everyone's going to have to try and reduce their carbon emissions as far as possible first, and then offsetting is a last resort.
So do you think that the offsetting piece should be something that is done nationally outside of the NHS?
Yeah, I think there's a real argument for that. There's a real argument that says if the NHS's emissions as a whole are never going to be able to get all the way to net zero, do we want to look at offsetting that last chunk as a country? and implementing it in schemes that are actually going to have other improvements and other benefits to local areas.
Yeah, because that you know, the seagrass piece, we just learned about it this year in our first ever webinar back in January, and I've been learning about it since then. And you know, the amount of carbon that can be captured through seagrass in comparison to even forestry, it's super interesting. And it's the whole offsetting, and I understand why you don't want to get into the ins and outs of it, because it is yeah, it's a little bit contentious, particularly with the public money piece, but there are some really interesting schemes that are out there just now.
It's an interesting one, because it's really hard actually for the NHS to ever fully get to net zero in all circumstances because of your resiliency, because on heat you're likely to still have gas-fired boilers as a backup. And if you ever need to turn those on, you're immediately then have bust your carbon budget. So there's going to have to be some sort of a way to offset, but it really is a last resort and just for things you can't change.
You can't control. I wonder if both of you want to let me know, Ricky, if you want to jump in, what do you think is the biggest challenge for trusts to achieve net zero? Another huge question. We've only got 15 minutes, so if you can answer it in that amount of time, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, what I was saying before is there's so many different ways and so many different projects of what can be done, but it's how do you do, so a lot of these things, they take space, they take time, they take money. How do you do them? And as Bethany was saying, then those things won't necessarily always get you all the way down to zero. But the challenging thing is deploying these. These are not a new build site where you can make it perfect how you want it. You know, quite often, you know, you walk in and the different parts of the site have been built at different times. Not everything is connected. So really difficult in terms of deployment of these technologies. As that's why Bethany is obviously absolutely right in terms of the first point is, you know, make sure that you're buying well, because this second point is more difficult. So that, yeah, I think that's a real challenging thing, and how all the different projects interlink. So, you know, there's a massive, or there's a funding for the public sector decarbonisation, and a lot of that was based around heat. So I'm assuming a lot of people, maybe even on this call, have got a lot of projects going on where their gas heating is largely becoming electrified. You know, what impact, you know, at what point did you measure what impact that's going to then have on how that side of your business operates, and how long would it take you to work that out? I think it's really complex, and I think that is definitely a stumbling block along the way.
Yeah, Ricky, if I can jump in on that as well, I think the planning side of this is something that needs to go beyond anything the NHS has really done before, because you are looking at complex estates, you're looking at sites, and you need to really make an assessment of, are all the buildings on this site actually possible to get to where I need them to be? Is the whole site actually not going to get there, and do we need to start planning for alternatives and actually looking at whether we can get funding for a new hospital on a different site? And some of the things people need to be thinking about are really that big. So if you start undertaking too many projects, small projects now that you know you can do something, you might actually then find you hit a block and you can't go any further, and that money could have been better spent by a different trust, because then you're going to have to move off that site anyway, potentially, or do something drastic that replaces all of what you've done before. So yeah, planning. It's got to be the main thing for me at the moment. Trusts need to map out how they're going to get there, and then start implementing things in the right order.
Yeah, again, that's something that came up in the transport webinar that we held this morning, is that we're not dealing a lot of the time with brand new, beautiful, state-of-the-art buildings. We're dealing with estates that are like pre-World War, the Victorian buildings. That is something beautiful, but St Ormond Street, you know, so Great Ormond Street in London, in the eye hospital, they're in the middle of city centres. They are not fit for modern lifestyles in terms of transport. There's just zero parking. People can't drive there. There's in terms of the way that they're built, they're graded, the grade listed buildings. How are you going to retrofit anything, double glazing, let alone anything, you know? So there's a huge amount of thought that needs to go into the estate that we actually have in this country, and if it is fit for purpose, and you know how we can. But again, huge amounts of money needs to go into if you're going to be starting from scratch, and when is that actually going to pay off in the future? How long is that actually going to take for that payoff to, if you move from the beautiful RVI in Newcastle, for example, how long until you'd actually see the return on a brand new hospital? We also have a question, sorry, I just had it up there, about electricity, Beth. So you suggested electricity will play a major role in the decarbonisation of heat. If everyone switched to an electrical heating solution, would there be enough supply to meet increased demand? So your favourite?
It's a great one, this one. I'm going to hedge my bets and say it depends where you are. Because there will be certain areas of the country where, yes, you could go fully electric with your heating and have no negative impact on the local network. And I'll let Ricky jump in again in a minute because he knows a lot more about the DNO than I do. But essentially, there are pockets here, and it depends entirely on what your local substation can handle and what your local area is able to actually take as infrastructure as it stands. And I've been talking to people on it this morning, actually, where we're finding that the local substations are in red, little or no spare capacity. So any project, even a small project that increases their electrical demand, they need to find a way to generate and store on site to try and balance that. And that's really challenging. And it is where companies like PowerStar come into their own in being able to offer a bit more of a solution around how your site operates as a grid itself. So I'll pass over to Ricky.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything you say there, Beth. Obviously, the DNO is one challenge, and like you say, that's very specific to where you are in the country, what your connection is, what is happening around there. You know, there's lots of things where there's developments and things that may have bought up land, and they may be holding agreements for that connection, which you can't access unless they, default on that. But I've come again back onto the user side is, okay, you might be able to get that power from the grid, but how do you get it onto and around your site? Is your existing electrical infrastructure ready for that and available for that? I was saying before, there's some of these sites that may be quite old, and maybe parts of the sites that are old and some parts that are newer. Is the switchgear up to standards to deliver that? Do you have enough transformer capacity to do that? Can you look at, as I said before, generation storage to deliver that? So there's always a way, but is it worth it in terms of, again, the cost that would come with that is always going to be the end question. But yeah, so that, again, comes down to that planning and the study and the feasibility that goes around that. Is all these projects impact, your site's infrastructure. So assessing where you are currently and understanding what you have and what you could have, speaking with your DNO and your electricity supplier, to have an idea of that is important to know what your roadmap going forward is.
Yeah, and you'll remember, if I'll jump back into, the start of the lockdowns, right at the beginning of last year, we saw some really unprecedented things going on with the national grid at that point in time. And it became very evident that actually, as we've moved to a more renewables-based grid, balancing that grid is becoming more expensive and more difficult when there's huge fluctuations in what people are using. So when you're looking at, we might see large increases in demand, we've got to find a way to actually have that generation available and have that generation available in a fuel mix for the national grid, because it can't all be renewables because we can't balance it. So there's got to be something to help make sure that that grid stays stable. And I don't think we've answered that challenge yet, really, Ricky, have we?
No, like there's not one solution. There's lots of things along the way. As I mentioned before, the smart meters is part of the understanding. And then there's assets. There's obviously grid scale generation and storage. But as you're right, as you add more and more of that on, the problem only gets bigger.
Yeah. And there's conversations around, can hydrogen plants help to balance the grid when we're looking at actually using water-based hydrogen going forwards? Can we look at large-scale gravity storage solutions and unusual solutions, innovative solutions? Because at the moment, really, we're using gas-fired power stations to make sure that we're in balance, and we can't do that as a country forever.
Yeah, and I suppose probably you'll know better than me as well, Beth, when these things come online and they do these projects and they deliver the energy from those sources, the cost of energy will only go one way.
Yeah.
Somebody has to pay for that in the end. Yeah.
So I wonder, I know that both of you are talking about, plan. It's super important to try and think about all the variables. Who do you guys think, if I'm a procurement manager, if I'm an estates manager within the NHS, and I'm like, okay, this is my plan for my estates, or this is my plan for this particular site for the next 5 years. Who do I want in the room from both the NHS side and then from the private sector, or from consultants like yourself, Beth? Who's going to be my brain trust that's going to put this plan together? And, how can I get that to those people to work together?
That's a really good question. And the answer really is initially, you're wanting all your large local stakeholders. So you probably want to include your ICS in this conversation. You want to have your local councils involved in this conversation, any other really large organisations in your local area. So if you've got a university that's local, this is where university and healthcare working together becomes really key. You're probably then also going to want to bring in, so consultants like ours, where we've got a broad range of experience. So we can talk about the procurement side and we can talk about the engineering side as well. From our side, we would have to have multiple internal stakeholders involved in this. So even within my own business, it would have to be through different departments within my business to come together to help. You'd want some people who have an awareness of design. So you're probably looking at modelling, you're looking at modelling your electrical infrastructure, you're looking at modelling your wet systems. And there are companies out there that do that at the moment. But really, so it's a very different world we're looking at here. But if you're thinking about it as an intelligent estate, you really want to understand, particularly if you've got a large acute site, you need to view that site as its own city, its own grid, and understand exactly how everything works on it.
Yeah, really similar to like how airports do it. They see themselves as little cities. Like Heathrow, it's probably twice the size of the village that I grew up in anyway. But it sees itself as its own like micro site of it, if it like a little city in itself, and it works on every single element is all put into place. And what do you think, Ricky? Who do you think else? Anyone else that you think needs to be in the room apart from yourself, of course?
I was going to say, from obviously specialist contractors or product or solution providers to help with the understanding of it's okay coming up with a plan, but get into the actual detail of what it is you need. Because I have lots and lots of conversations with people about battery storage projects, and half the time it's not actually what they need. It's just something because it does sound good, take a battery, put some energy in it and use it, but it's not necessarily always what they need. So making sure that you engage with those specialists to make sure you've got a full understanding of what's out there and what actually is the application for it. I'll come back again. Don't want to go back into my presentation, but primary that application I was talking about was about power resilience. So it's a solution to a problem that you already have and you already have to provide a solution for. But then it's making sure that and knowing that can facilitate all these other wonderful things that we've been talking about.
Okay, well, I'm going to round off with a question of my own. And I just want to know from both of you, in the next 5 years, what do you think is going to be some of the, what do you think is going to change? What's going to be the biggest advancements in sustainable energy for the NHS or for the country or globally? It's a big question. You can start if you want, Ricky.
Biggest advancements that is a big question. I think there's just going to be a massive continuation of decarbonising the grid as a general, so those generation sources and the pressure that they'll be under once people start buying more of these green fuel mixes. But I'll let Beth touch more on that. But from my point of view, the increase in deployment of on-site, so these microgrid scenarios, as we've just been mentioning, that's what I see as being a massive part, and we've been developing and working with that for the last 5 years already, and that's only going one way, and that's what everybody's talking about, and that's what everybody says they need. Not that it will always include battery storage, is what I'm talking about, but the requirement to manage your own energy on site will be a big step forward, I believe.
Yeah, and do you think that the advancements in things like AI and machine learning algorithms that can have real-time energy distribution facilities will help with the likes of your hardware at PowerStar.
Oh, absolutely, because it's all about driving. I mean, something like a storage system will only do whatever you tell it to do. So it's all about understanding what the drivers are, what you're trying to achieve, resilience, offsetting peak demand, managing peak input, and actually being able to forecast that going forward, because that's all about how you manage the state of charge of the system, is trying to understand what's going to happen in the future so that you can make sure you're prepared and deliver that. Because you might have a battery full of energy and then it's no good then when the sun comes out the next day and you've got lots of excess solar. So that part of it is pivotal to making sure that's the optimization piece really around these assets and making sure they function to the best of their ability.
What are your thoughts, Beth?
Well, I was going to say, I think tech's going to be a huge thing. I honestly think my history prior to Enenco is in building management systems. And one of the things that really shocks me is how aged the building management systems on NHS estates are. And I think it talks to the fact that we haven't got there yet in terms of the intelligent management of the estate. And there's a lot you can do with a building to bring down its usage just by understanding where you actually need things and having the control where you need it. So yeah, I absolutely think tech is going to be a huge impact. But also I think we have to see a major increase in renewable generation. And that has to be both on estates and off estates. And I would expect within the next 5 years that every NHS trust should have a strategic estates plan, which is going to account for adaptation to climate change that we're expecting to happen and how they're going to reach these net zero targets. And if we can get there within 5 years, that we know how we're going to get there by 2040, I think that stands everyone in really good stead.
Really, really great thought to end off the webinar, Beth. I appreciate that. So we'll come to the end of our third webinar of the day for the Sustainability Day of Action. So thank you to everyone who's come to all of our webinars, and thank you to everyone who's come to this one particularly today. Thanks to Ricky and thanks to Beth for your time, your insight and your inspiration as well, and your actionable practical advice. I think is been really, really helpful, hopefully, and valuable to everyone on the call today. We've got Steph saying thank you in the chat. Really appreciate you're getting involved there, Steph. And as always, and as the other two from today, this whole session has been recorded. Anyone who's signed up will get an email with the edited version once that's been done. Everything will be written up and go on Sustainability Partnerships website, and make sure to follow us across all of our social platforms for more updates on more events coming up. Our next event isn't until the end of July, and that's going to be about removing plastics from the NHS. So anyone who's interested in speaking at that event, anyone who has any interesting comment, please feel free to get in touch with us to get involved with that one. But nearly the end of the day on Friday, so I'm going to let everyone go with a minute to spare, and have a great weekend. Thanks so much for joining, and we'll speak to you soon.